What up? The new iPad 10th Gen has landed, powered by the A14 Bionic chip. Today we're going to see how 15 games perform on this graphics chip. Our first game to look at is Wreckfest, the Demolition Derby themed racing game. This port is interesting for a number of reasons. Handy Games told me they're using Molten VK here, which translates the Vulkan renderer entirely into metal. It uses up to 1.3 GB of memory at peak here, supports MSAA and TAA anti-aliasing, a customized version of the Romu engine, and advanced graphical effects such as shadows, motion blur, and bloom. Wreckfest on the new iPad offers a better experience than the recent Nintendo Switch port. It not only runs faster and looks better, but more importantly, it supports up to 24 cars simultaneously in a race, compared to 16 on the Switch, and there are also custom graphic options. By default, the game targets 30 FPS here, with a mix of medium and high settings. This is probably the best way to play the game here, as it looks pretty good and the FPS doesn't really fluctuate. On the other hand, if you want, you can change the FPS target to 60 and it's still very playable. The new iPad remains a low-end device, so playing at higher settings is not always advised here. For example, putting settings to high sees anywhere from 40 to 60 FPS. Some of you might find this tolerable, I imagine. Max settings is quite a bit worse, as the FPS often drops below 30, which is just not what we want. Another suggestion, if you want nice graphics, you can play at mostly high settings with a 30 FPS cap, and it's pretty doable. Divinity Original Sin 2 requires an iPad with an A12 chip and 4 GB of RAM. This means you can now play Divinity Original Sin 2 on the new iPad. It wasn't possible on the iPad 9th Gen with A13 and only 3 GB of RAM. This means the game is now playable on every new iPad, from iPad Pro, iPad Air, iPad Mini, all the way to iPad. Originally it was an iPad Pro and Air exclusive. As you can see, it has, well, pretty bad performance on this new iPad. Before you go and freak out, the game should be able to reach 30 FPS in a future update, after LVRLs optimize it. Consider this. This new iPad is basically the iPad Air 4th Gen. It has the same A14 chip, 4 GB of RAM, and the same Liquid Retina display, targeting 2360 by 1640. If the iPad Air 4th Gen runs the game at an almost locked 30 FPS, there is no reason that this new iPad can't. Just like the iPad Air 4, it's running at 1920 by 1335 with near ultra high settings enabled by default, and uses only 2.7 GB of memory at peak. The game is brilliant to play with a mouse and keyboard, especially with the new Magic Keyboard Folio, as it comes with a trackpad. Up next we have Alien Isolation. Thanks to contrast adaptive sharpening, Isolation can scale well on all its supported iPhone and iPads. This means you're not going to see a big difference visually over last year's iPad, but performance-wise, it's quite an improvement in some respects. The iOS port of Isolation offers a few graphic modes. First is Graphics. Graphics runs the game at the highest resolution but caps the FPS to 30. The FPS sticks closer to its 30 FPS target now, and less frequently drops into the low 20s, compared to what we saw on the iPad 9th Gen. The frame pacing in this mode is dramatically improved too. It's not perfect, but this is the first time we can sometimes see even pacing. Performance runs the game at a slightly lower resolution to reach up to 60 FPS. The new iPad can now actually reach 60 FPS. Sometimes. But it still drops down to 30 during challenging scenes. Remember, this device isn't as powerful as an iPad Pro or Air, so don't expect a locked 60 FPS here. Unfortunately, Apex Legends has mixed performance here. Extreme HD graphics quality is not great. The FPS drops into the low 40s frequently.
Pity.
Ultra HD sees the same results. Heck, even HD has the same issues. Something just as simple as looking around Kings Canyon, the open map, has an impact on the frame rate. Right now, to get 60 FPS, you have to play at normal graphics quality. Otherwise, if you don't want to play at normal, you can play at recommended settings, which are Ultra HD, with a high frame rate for 40 FPS. Keep in mind, Apex Legends Mobile receives 60 FPS at Extreme HD on the iPad 9th Gen, so it should be able to match that here after Respawn updates it for this hardware. I keep forgetting to mention you can enable an in-game FPS counter for this game. This is a good idea to show how changing different graphical settings affects the performance. Memoir Blue made a surprise App Store release this month, thanks to Annapurna Interactive. It is a short interactive poem about a superstar athlete and the all-encompassing love between mother and daughter. It's one of the few games I know of with support for one of the latest Metal frameworks, version 2.4. Compared to the last year's iPad, the game appears to be running at a higher resolution, which makes text easier to read, and the overall image is much less blurry. I asked Annapurna Interactive what resolution the game targets on this iPad, and they gave me a tentative answer saying, it should be a preset setting, there is no adjustment needed. Okay, while we don't know what resolution it is running at, I compared it to the PC version. It looks to be targeting low graphics by default, with depth of field and anti-aliasing absent. The mobile version is capped at 30 FPS too. The frame pacing is mostly okay, but it does have some issues during challenging scenes. Look, it's not an ambitious title in the graphics department and is powered by Unity. Still, even at lower settings, it remains visually appealing, and the unique art style presentation isn't lost in translation. Ooh, everyone wants to see this game. Genshin Impact is a pretty big game in the graphics department, and the world on offer, I guess. I imagine many of you want to know how it performs here. I'm not a massive fan of this game, as you can probably tell every time I show it, so the footage might be questionable at best. Regardless, the game is best played at low settings here. I know, tragic, I'm so sorry. To be honest, the game still looks pretty good at low graphics. Anyway, for the best experience, you should play it low with 30 FPS enabled. This will result in a good experience for long play sessions. You can play at 60 FPS, but be warned it will drop into the low 40s occasionally. Medium settings are somewhat achievable here, I guess. Mind you, 60 FPS is not ideal, as the FPS drops into the low 30s and sometimes below that often. So be sure to put the FPS cap to 30 to avoid huge FPS drops. The frame pacing isn't nearly as good as low 30 FPS, but most of you, I guess, won't notice? XCOM 2 may be quite old now, but it's still one of the most demanding mobile games on the App Store. It contains a few graphic modes. First is graphics, which runs the game at the highest resolution possible, with an FPS target of 30. As you can see, it doesn't really hit that target here. In fact, it's nowhere near it, going down to 15 FPS at times. Performance mode is supposed to provide 40 FPS with a lower resolution, but that just isn't the case right now. Similar to Divinity Original Sin 2 and many of the games on this list, XCOM 2 is in dire need of an update. Based on my testing, the game only uses up to 1.5 GB of memory at peak, so having only 4 GB of memory here shouldn't be a problem. Gunfire Reborn, the awesome new FPS game, isn't demanding. It can run at high settings here with a locked 60 FPS. We saw exactly the same performance on the M2 iPad Pro in my last video. Still, it's very enjoyable here, and that's good. You really need to check out this one. As I've said many times, it is the best premium FPS game released on mobile in years, with a mix of Doom, Borderlands, Dead Cells, Hades. Out comes a fantastic roguelike FPS adventure. It runs on the original version of the Metal framework, which might allow it to scale down well on low-end or old Apple mobile hardware. I'm showing SpongeBob again. Playing at epic quality is not advised on this device, as the FPS is usually below 50, sometimes going down as low as 30 FPS. If you play at high settings, you can reach up to 60 FPS, but keep in mind it's not locked. It will still drop down to the low 40s. In this case, medium settings for SpongeBob SquarePants is required if you're looking for an almost locked 60 FPS. Similar to my Apple TV 4K video showcasing the Pathless, I don't know what resolution is targeted here. Annapurna Interactive told me, and you've heard me say this, we use Unreal's dynamic resolution feature to allow the resolution to vary depending on workload. We continually balance performance and image quality and aim for as close to full HD as possible. We also use Unreal's temporal upscaling feature, which reconstructs a high-resolution image for display. So often small and even medium-sized changes to the dynamic resolution aren't noticeable. That's all fine and dandy, Annapurna, but it's not helping with the performance. The FPS is just disgusting here. It's bad on practically every iPhone and iPad, heck, even the iPad Pro, which it just shouldn't be. The game takes up 1.7 GB of memory at peak, so that shouldn't be the bottleneck either. Why, Annapurna Interactive, why can't this game be better? Anyways, NBA 2K23 Arcade Edition plays very nicely on the new iPad. Previously on the A13 iPad, most of the video settings would be set to a mix of high and medium, with tone mapping and reflection disabled. Now on the 10th gen iPad by default, the game will launch with all settings set to high, except for texture, which is set to ultra high, and only reflection blur is disabled. This is the best way to play the game, with a locked 60 FPS during gameplay and 30 FPS during camera cinematics, but that's the same in everything. Now yes, you can play with everything at ultra high, and it mostly stays at 60 FPS, which is good. However, on the odd occasion it may drop down as low as 40 FPS in this state. The only issue with choosing your own graphics here is that when you close and relaunch the app, it always defaults back to high settings, which is weird. It does that on everything. Every device, should I say. I'm in a weird mood today, guys. A weird mood, and I don't know. Dead Cells isn't a demanding game. It runs well on anything. I've even played it on a 2013 MacBook Air, and it plays wonderfully there. So it should be no surprise it's mostly a locked 60 FPS here. I say mostly because sometimes it will drop to, say, 58 or 50 FPS randomly for a few frames, but hardly ever. And I doubt any of you will notice this with the naked eye. It's running at 1080p resolution, and then it's upscaled to the device's native display resolution, which is 2360 by 1640. By default, Feral Interactive's Total War Medieval 2 runs up to 60 FPS, and near high settings on the new iPad. Quite impressive for the A14 Bionic, in my opinion. Then again, this game is quite old now, which works in its favour to see this type of performance, I suppose. It's not a locked 60 FPS. It can drop quite low, especially when zooming out of battles. Then again, this does happen on most iPhone and iPad, so I'm not that disappointed. The game is brilliant to play with a mouse and keyboard too. I have the new Magic Keyboard Folio, which comes with a trackpad, and it makes this just like a desktop experience. It's really cool. What Remains of Edith Finch is a collection of strange tales about a family in Washington state. The game is now running at high graphics and the same resolution as new iPad Pros and iPad Airs, which is 1152 by 1084. While it's quite a low resolution, falling below 1080p, you can still clearly read the dialogue that appears during exploration. The dialogue is one of the most important aspects of this narrative adventure game. The FPS target is 30 here. It is on all iPhone and iPads. And while the frame pacing isn't anywhere near as good as, let's say, a new iPad Pro, it's still miles better than the PS4 and Xbox One version. Holy moly, that one is terrible in the frame pacing department. There is also one part of the game where the frame rate target is 45 FPS. This is during the thought-provoking and hauntingly beautiful story of Calvin on the Swing Set. The slightly higher FPS is to work around a stability issue with physics as you swing up and down. Many older devices don't actually hit 45 FPS, so the scene looks a bit weird, but finally on the new iPads, it is. I'd also like to quickly note the game uses up to only 1.6 gigabytes of memory at peak, which is impressive for a game of this visual caliber. Our last game to look at is Descenders by Noodle Cake. Descenders runs at low graphics on every iPhone and iPad by default and only targets 30 FPS. The frame delivery is also not ideal here. I hope in the future the dev can add some custom graphic options and maybe 60 FPS. That would be magical. All that being said, even if you play this game on a Windows PC or Mac at max graphics, it's not what I'd call a hugely impressive game visually. So playing it low, honestly, doesn't look that much different here. It's also just a brilliant downhill bike game, so I can give it some forgiveness with its technical faults, because it's really gosh dang diddly dong dong fun. What do you think of the gaming performance of the new iPad 10th Gen? Are you impressed or disappointed? Some of you may come away from this a little blue, but don't forget this is just an entry-level iPad. It may share the same design as the new iPad Pro and Air, but it won't offer the same type of gaming performance, especially for AAA games, and when we compare it to M1. But in most cases, it gets the job done. It's good for beginners or for people who are upgrading from an old iPad. Many games need to be updated for the hardware here. That has been a recurring theme in this video, and I apologize, but I didn't want to keep delaying this video based off that. I may look at it again in the future. The display has changed considerably, and the jump from A13 to A14 is actually quite substantial. Anyway, leave a like if you found this video helpful, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to stay up to date with gaming on Apple hardware. My name's Stewie, and thanks for watching.